get too comfortable. Yeah, the VIP section. Well, thank you so much for coming out on this rainy evening to hear Stephanie's talk. It's been so great to have Stephanie Gordon's work here in the library. I feel like there's been more people wanting to come up here than I remember in the past, and that's always really exciting for us. Stephanie Gordon, as some of you may know, received her Bachelor's in Fine Arts from the University of Michigan. She studied for a year in France, and she was a teacher at Hanover High School for 18 years. And believe it or not, I was there during not all 18 years, but 4 of them. And Encaustics is such a fascinating process, so I'm sure that there'll be time for questions at the end. But without any further ado, I'm going to pass it over to Stephanie. Thank you so much for being here.
Mila? So thank you all for coming, especially for coming out on such a wet, cold night. And I also want to thank AVA for giving me the opportunity to show my work and also to talk to all of you. It's really a pleasure. So I'm going to talk first a little bit about my art background. Then I'm going to tell you what encaustics are and how you make them. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about my own process in making these works. I was one of those people who always liked to draw and make things. When I was in elementary school, my Thanksgiving feast dioramas and my drawings of the water cycle were always the best. I got into trouble for illustrating the margins of my textbooks. I think my parents had to pay to replace a number of them. And I also got yelled at for drawing while my teachers lectured. But if any of you feel the need to doodle or knit or do things with your hands while I'm talking, I totally understand. As an older child, my parents were really sympathetic to my desires. They sent me to the Cleveland Museum of Art. I spent a lot of time there looking at art and making art. And then in high school, I was one of those people who hung out in the art room. I was the first girl in my school to take print shop. In those days, girls only did home ec. So a friend of mine and I petitioned the principal, and we were allowed to take print shop because we wanted to learn not only how the design part of doing design, but also how to use the mechanical tools that you need to make prints. So the boys in the class didn't really know what to make of us, but they were kind of disappointed because they had to watch their language and be polite. Then, as Mila said, I went on and I got my BFA at the University of Michigan. I spent my junior year studying in Aix-en-Provence, France, and I studied etching, design, stained glass, and French culture. After graduation, I worked as a graphic designer and in stained glass. And then I married Steve here in the first row in the comfy chair. And we moved to the Upper Valley almost 40 years ago. So I'm trying to think, 1992, we moved to Iowa for a year. And Steve was getting his PhD at the University of Iowa. And that's when I first started painting landscapes, because people thought Iowa was boring. Even Iowans thought Iowa was boring. You know, pigs and corn. That's what people thought of when they thought of Iowa. So I started painting the landscape there, and I thought Iowa was beautiful. It had these subtly rolling hills. I really liked being able to see the actual structure of the land, and people really appreciated my landscapes. They liked someone showing them how beautiful their environment was. So that's been one of my motivating forces ever since, is to show people how gorgeous the world that they live in actually is. And then when we moved back to Piermont, and our kids were small, and there was no art program at all in our local elementary school. So I decided to volunteer and go in and teach art classes. I figured I was better than nothing. And it was so rewarding and so exciting to me to share what I knew with those kids. They were such a fabulous audience. Kids are fearless. They will take any material and just dive in and start working and make fabulous stuff. So I decided to go back to school and get my teaching certificate and start teaching art. And that's been a great thing for me, not only in terms of the fact that I love teaching art, but also in terms of my professional development as an artist, because art teachers are generalists. And being an art teacher gave me the opportunity to explore so many media and techniques and then incorporate them into my own art. And I might not have come across many of them if I had continued working on my own as a designer and stained glass person and painter. So the first time I saw encaustics were during a trip to the Metropolitan Museum of Art in 2007. I was actually wandering around the hallways of the Met while the rest of my family waited in the lobby looking for a restroom. And I went down this hallway and I just stopped dead because I was confronted by some beautiful, luminous portraits. And this is an example of what I saw. And this is one of the Fayum mummy portraits, which are the best known examples of encaustic painting from antiquity. And what they were encaustics that are painted on panels, and then they were affixed to the front of mummy cases so that people would know who was in them and as a memorial to them. So I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So after I saw those paintings, I said, I need to learn how to do this. This is really great. And people were doing some encaustics at that time, but not so much. So I took a class at the Penland School of Crafts in 2008, and I've been doing encaustics ever since. So what is encaustic? Encaustic is basically hot wax, and it's pigmented wax. You use it in molten form, and the layers are heated to fuse together. So it's translucent, it's luminous. You can get this beautiful sense of depth in your work. It's durable. You can use it for collage. You can create incredible amounts of textures. So it's an extremely versatile medium, and it's really fun to use and a lot of fun to experiment with. So, encaustics were first used in ancient Greece. Shipbuilders used hot wax, hot beeswax, to waterproof the hulls of their ships. And then over time, they started pigmenting the paint, coloring the wax, and creating designs on their ships. So in his writings, Homer noted that there were painted warships back in 800 BC. So it's an extremely ancient form of art. Next, the use of encaustics diverged. It was used flat in paintings on panel, and also to color clay and marble sculptures, and that's called polychroming. So all those Greek sculptures that you see in museums that are now white marble, originally they were garishly painted in all sorts of colors. They looked sort of like carousel animals. So they're quite different from how we see them today. And just as a proof of it being used on an antique vase from the 4th century from Greece, there's an illustration of encaustic being applied to a statue. The waxes and tools were heated over a charcoal brazier. So, we've come a long way since then. So then there was the Greeks. There was a Greek population in Egypt after Alexander's conquest in 330 BC. So there was a large Greek population there. And they brought this encaustic technique with them to Egypt. So, but they adopted local funerary customs. So that's why you get this combination of this traditional Greek painting method in Egyptian mummy cases. And then there was also a Roman contingent there after Cleopatra died. So if you look at this one, you'll see that he's actually wearing kind of a Roman wreath around his head. So you get all three cultures coming together. And there was a huge trove of these Fayum encaustics discovered in 1880 by a British archaeologist. They were really well preserved because they were in a dark, dry tomb. So that was perfect conditions. And so the Met owns a number of them. But after that, encaustics fell into disuse. People used them here or there, but not very much. And then finally, they were revived in the modern era. Artists as diverse as Diego Rivera, Arthur Dove, and Carl Zerbe all used encaustic. And the most famous example, of course, is Jasper Johns. So I bet many of you recognize this. Oh, I see some people hate Jasper Johns in this audience. But he liked using encaustics because he could get a lot of texture. He could use collage elements with it. And things were much harder for him. Nobody was doing it at the time. He had to make his own pigments. And I also read that he used a hot plate attached to a stick to heat his material. So that's pretty funny. And then in the 90s, there was a renewed interest in using encaustic. And nowadays, it's really great because there's all sorts of commercial waxes and tools available. And so in the last 10 or 20 years, it's really been going through a resurgence, and it's quite popular. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the tools that I use, because that's something that people always want to know about. This is my heated palette. This is a very expensive anodized aluminum milled sheet, and underneath it has this cheesy hot plate from, So, but you don't need to have something this fancy to start with. For a number of years when I started doing encaustics, I just used a pancake griddle. And if you use that, you're never going to want to make pancakes on it again. So encaustic waxes, you can buy encaustic waxes, and they look like they come in these little blocks or in round shapes in all sorts of different colors. Some of my favorites are metallic. I love sparkly stuff, which you probably know if you've looked at my work. And the thing about encaustics is that you have to heat the layers. You have to fuse them so that they bond and they don't fall apart. So there's a number of ways you can do that. I'm going to step back a minute, actually, and start from the beginning. So when you're doing encaustics, you have to use panels that are rigid, because if you use something that bends, your encaustic wax will crack and fall off. And you also need to use something that's absorbent, because the wax needs something to hang on to. So you start with that. You need something that's rigid and that's absorbent. And then you heat your waxes on your hot palette, and you can either take your wax sticks and melt them directly onto the palette, or you can use little containers and you can heat your waxes in there if you know you're going to use a large amount of a certain color and you want to have a lot of it. I have these little clothespins here so that I don't burn myself when I move them around. And also, There's different kinds of waxes. I use paraffin to clean my brushes, and I use encaustic medium, which is beeswax and damar resin. Damar resin is resin that comes from a tree. And the resin gives the beeswax a little bit more solidity and rigidity. So you start by heating your panel, and then you take your molten wax, and you can put that, you can use these really nice big brushes to apply your wax. And you put them on there. And after you've gotten one layer down, you have to use your heat gun to fuse your wax. And you can also use a torch. Some people use torches. One of the things you have to be careful with in caustic is the temperature that it's at, because if it goes up too high, the encaustics will release volatile compounds into the atmosphere, which you don't want to breathe. They're not carcinogenic, but they cause respiratory irritation and irritation to your eyes. Some people who are sensitive to it can get headaches. So you want to keep your waxes in a very narrow range of temperature from like 170 to 190. And if it goes over that, it's bad for you. And if it's under that, it won't be melted. So when you fuse your work, you have to do that after each new layer of wax. That's the tricky part, because you want to do it just enough so that you get your layers to adhere, but not so much that you melt everything, which when you're a beginner is pretty easy to do. And some people like to use that melting technique actually to create certain effects, so that's okay too. Some people use torches, but again, torches are higher temperature and they can leach those volatile compounds out. And also it can create some really exciting times. When I was taking my first class, I was doing a collage piece and it had lots of wood shavings in it, and I was using a torch to fuse it, and I hadn't really considered the effects of using flammable materials, wax and a torch together. So it was really good that we had a fire extinguisher close by. That was, that was very exciting. So after that, I changed over to a heat gun. I use all sorts of tools. One of the great things about using encaustic is that you not only paint things on, but you also can scrape them away. So I use palette knives, and I use pottery tools, and forks, and dental tools, and clay tools. So anything that you can make a mark with, you can, scrape things away, you can scratch into it, you can build it up, you can make things sculptural. So you can use things from your kitchen or workshop or whatever to create interesting effects. And that's really fun. Okay, so my encaustic process. I'm sure that all of you have looked around at some of these, and if not, feel free to look at them afterwards. In that first encaustic class that I took, my teacher taught us to use encaustics like traditional oils or acrylics. And after I was done with the class, I thought, well, what's the point of that? If I'm going to do a painting that looks like an oil painting, I might as well do an oil painting. So I didn't think that took advantage of the unique properties of the medium. So I started incorporating collage materials, handmade papers and thread and pieces of lace and foil. And I particularly liked incorporating foil because below my studio for many years was this nice little shop that sold Green Mountain chocolates. So they come wrapped in really pretty foils. So it's like, oh, I need some foil for my encaustic. I'll have to go down and buy some chocolates. Woohoo! So that was good all the way around. So, and the other thing I love about working in encaustics is I love process. Before I did encaustics, I did mixed media pieces that had step after step after step, and that's really fun for me. So I would take a digital photo, and then I would manipulate it in Photoshop, and then I would print it on a piece of handmade paper or on fabric, and then I would scan that, and then I would print it again, and then I would paint on top of it. So, you know, I'm one of those artists that just likes, you know, well, I'm gonna do this, and then I'm gonna do this, and then I'll do this. So Encaustics gives me the same opportunities, because typically I start with either a white panel, which I then use pastels or oil pastels on to tone in various ways, because those are compatible with encaustics, or I affix a piece of handmade paper, or, you know, several pieces of different handmade papers to a panel, and then that's my basic starting point. Then I put my first layer encaustic on, and then I often use elements of what's called image transfer. Now, this came out of very practical concern for me. Over the last 10 or 15 years, I've developed a tremor. It's quite common among a lot of people. It's called an essential tremor. And so I couldn't draw really precise lines or paint them like I used to. And so you'd get that kind of, you know, that doesn't look like a tree branch, that looks like a piece of yarn. So I wanted a way that I could continue to make paintings that had precise elements in them that I could no longer draw or paint on my own anymore. So then I'll use elements of photo transfer, which is where you take, I use my own photographs, of course, which is where I take one of my photos and then make a Xerox copy of it, and then you can put that face down on your warm wax and you burnish it in, and the larger the piece, the harder it is to do. And then you rub off with water the paper backing, and the toner is transferred into the wax. So you have those elements right in the piece. And so if you look at this one, you can see all these tiny little branch elements. Those are photo transfer. And then I go back in and I put more encaustic on top of the photo transfer elements, and sometimes I put photo transfers from different pictures on top of the ones that are underneath, so I can go on forever. And you know, I scrape things off and put other things back in, so it's it just really appeals to the part of me that enjoys you know, messing around with materials, which is, you know, one of the great joys of painting or drawing or doing sculpture or anything creative. So my subject matter, I still love doing landscapes. These are all from this area. I think we are so lucky to live in such a wonderful environment, and I'm happy to do paintings of them that share my feelings about our wonderful valley with others. Opening people's eyes to the beauty of a particular moment is something that I'm really delighted to be able to do. So that's my talk about encaustics, and if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Yes?
So, how do you know when to stop?
Oh, isn't that a good question? Yeah, I heard one artist say, he always stops his paintings when they're done. So, sometimes I go too far, you know, and then if that happens, I can either put something completely different over them, scrape them down, or they make great fire starters for bonfires. Yeah. So
you don't have an image in your mind when...
Sometimes I do. Sometimes I'm working towards something, but I'm sure, you know, sometimes you start a piece of art and you have an idea of where it's going to go, but then it ends up someplace completely different. So I would say almost none of them did I have a specific idea of what it was going to be when it was done. Because then once you start sticking all the glittery stuff and the shiny threads and the handmade papers in there, it's like, oh, well, if I did this, then I need to do this over in this corner here. So it's sort of an organic thing. Yes?
Well, I don't know if you can answer this, but to me there's like a couple different styles in your encaustics. Like, what is that about? Is that, like, do you do them differently, or?
Yes. Some of them look different because the techniques are slightly different. If you look at the ones that have more of the image transfer in them, those are the ones that tend to have the black linear style. And then some of them have more found objects or papers incorporated in them. So I actually have a lot that aren't on display here that look substantially different from these as well. And so my work's not totally consistent, but it is due to different working styles as well as different kind of subject matter.
I have a couple just practical questions.
Sure.
You mentioned heating the panel. Do you have to keep it warm throughout each time you're putting on the layer?
You don't, and actually that's something that you can do as an artistic element, because if your panel is warm and you keep it warm, you can get a very smooth surface. So if you want to have, I don't know, maybe you want to do a meditative abstract because you're a yoga practitioner. You could do it that way. Or also, if you're doing the image transfer technique, if you have a very smooth surface, then you get much better results in your image transfer. But if you're somebody that likes a lot of texture, because the wax starts cooling as soon as it comes off the palette or off the brush, if you use your panel cool and let your wax cool a little bit, then you get all sorts of really cool texture, you know, like Monet and his cathedral or his haystacks, where you build up different colors on top of each other.
That sort of answers my other question. I was going to ask how thick the wax is, but it sounds like you can vary that.
Yes.
Depending on what you want.
Exactly, exactly. The panel that I was talking about earlier, well, this is actually, one thing that you can do if you want to use your wax very thick is you can take a piece of tape, like blue painter's tape, and you put it around the side of your panel so that it's sticking up and makes, an inch or however deep you want sort of surround on your piece of wood. And you can actually pour wax in there on top of objects and make things that are three-dimensional and more like assemblages than they are like, flat two-dimensional pieces of work. Yeah.
So, I don't know this stuff. But when I used to color with crayons, the bigger the box, you got a lot more colors in there. But I see you have those big hunks of things, probably 5 different ones. Do you get a good palette out of those, or do you have many? Do
Well,
they mix well?
they do mix well. They do mix well. And if you come up later, you can look on my palette, and I left some colors that I mixed here. But you do have to have some right basic colors. I taught a class on beginning encaustic last month here, and all the students got a little introduction to encaustic set, and it had certain colors in it. It had a red, a blue, a green, a yellow, and a white. And there were certain colors that they could not mix with the colors that they had, because particularly the blue didn't play well with the other colors. But I have enough colors that with what I have here, I can mix pretty much anything I want. And then I do get certain specialty colors that I know that I like to use a lot. And I mean, these things are expensive, really expensive. These little things are about $8 a piece. So any art pursuit is expensive, but encaustic paints are really expensive. So people who are making quite large things often try to make their own pigments for their encaustics, and you can do that by, you can actually even make your own encaustic medium by mixing your beeswax and your Damar varnish, but it's very tedious. And then some people use oil paints to color their encaustic medium, or you can use dry pigment, which is actually kind of dangerous because then you're in danger of inhaling the loose stuff. So you have to be very careful if you do that. But you can make your waxes considerably less expensive if you mix your colors yourself. It's like the old days, when the painters used to grind their pigment and then mix it with oil. So it's just the binder is wax rather than oil.
So your style is very, all these things are a certain size, pretty small. Is that a style, or is that a choice, or you just don't want to finish it before?
Well, there's a couple of reasons, okay? I like making art, and I like it when people like it well enough to actually purchase it and have a piece. So if I keep the pieces small, I can make them affordable. And also, then if people buy them, I can make more. So it works out well for everybody.
What's the largest you've ever done?
Well, the one around the corner, I believe it's 18 by 18. That's the biggest I'm completed. I'm working on one that's 18 by 24 right now. I'm trying to do some bigger pieces, but when you work, or at least for me, when I work larger, it gets harder exponentially rather than in a linear manner. So it's going to take a really long time to complete bigger pieces. Yeah, I like doing the smaller ones also because it's nice to be able to finish something in a reasonable amount of time. And yeah, I like working that size. It's a nice size. They're portable. I only needed one box to bring all my work here. Lots of practical reasons.
I wonder if you could pick out a couple and sort of talk about what you did, or show us where the photo transfer is, and can we get up and...
Sure. Okay. Why don't you come around the corner here, if everybody wouldn't mind. I'll talk about this one. Okay, so this is one I started with a toned canvas, because the trees are the photo transfer element.
Wow.
So I know pretty much where those trees are going to be when I transfer them. So I started by toning the canvas with blue on top, and then you can see this kind of turquoise, and then it went to green underneath. Then I went ahead and I put the photo transfer on top of that.
Look close if I can.
Yeah, so you see in here, you can see these little, and this is the other cool thing about encaustics, is that you don't have to be, go up to people's artworks and they say, oh, don't touch them, but these actually, you can, use your hand to burnish them. So touching encaustics is okay. So
Had a Cuban sandwich, I don't think you.
grease is all right.
Well, that's how, and it's so smooth.
Yeah, and then so I drew back into them with oil pastels and pastels, and then I put some thread and some of my candy wrappers on top, and then I put some more encaustic on top of that, and at each step I was fusing them, okay? And because I had my initial wax layer, the oil pastels and the pastels become bonded with the wax, so they're not going to come off.
And the threads, how do they bond? They sort of
I put encaustic wax on top of them, and then they just stick in there.
In a thin layer.
Yeah.
Do they ever fall off?
Yeah, if you're a little rough with them, you can displace them. I may have to repair that one.
That's great.
So,
And then, let's see.
This one's a little dreamier, is that what?
This one? Yeah, so this one started with handmade paper. You can see that's what these elements are in here. So I started with handmade paper, then the same thing. You know, I put down a layer of purple on top of that, and you know, then toned the background. Then the trees were transferred, and then I went back in with both encaustic paint and you know, oil pastels and regular pastels. So
here, did you put clear
yes, I used the.
on?
That's right. Although it's not perfectly clear, the beeswax is always it's beeswax. Yeah, it's a little bit yellow. I use bleached. Bleached wax, but it's still not perfectly clear, and it's not perfectly white. So that's part of what gives it that dreamy, translucent quality. And thank you. And then the more layers you use, the greater sense of depth you'll get as well.
So, wow, it has to be really thin. I mean, some of it's just so flat and smooth.
Yeah, I use mine thinner than a lot of people. But the other thing is, when you use your heat gun to fuse it, that levels the surface as well.
Oh, right.
So if you want a lot of texture, there's, you know, a balance between keeping the piece together and, you know, you know, keeping your texture.
So how the old timers do this without the heat guns? They just
Yeah, it must have been incredibly difficult. Well, in this picture on this vase, there's a big charcoal brazier, and there's all these metal tools that are sticking out of the charcoal, and yeah. So it's like applying the wax with a really hot poker, and the wax itself is molten as well. And I don't know. I mean, I can only imagine that maybe they had some sort of container that they could, you know, take coals up next to the statue and then, you know, fuse it that way. But I imagine it would be incredibly difficult and dangerous, and you would end up burning yourself a lot. So
that must have been very thin layers too, and on the statues.
yeah, I really don't know. That's a question I can't ask. I mean, I can't answer. I can ask it, but I can't answer it.
That's interesting. I had no idea that polychrome was wax.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think the reason that encaustic fell out of favor is because oil painting and tempera painting came into vogue, and those are just so much easier comparatively than using hot pokers and braziers to heat your medium. So
So do you suppose they had art openings back there?
I'm sure they did.
Interesting.
But things like wall frescoes were paint and pigment, presumably.
Those were dried pigment that were you know, that were painted on wet plaster. And so it was, well, I mean, the pigment was damp, but it was just pigment without a binder. And then once it was applied to the plaster kept it in place. So that was kind of another laborious process, but different than this. Well, oh, yes.
Just quickly, you know, you were introduced to Encaustics a decade ago, and you know, you've been so fearless throughout your career trying different media. I wonder, are you thinking about anything else around the corner, or are you feeling you're going to be in Encaustics for another decade?
I'm still pretty happy with encaustics. And there's a lot of different ways of using encaustics that I could explore. So I think I'll be working with them for a while longer.
Great. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah, well, thank you all for coming and for your great questions.